woman like you was worth waiting for," said the aging frontier judge after the young widow talked the mob out of hanging him. The rope was already around my neck when she rode in. I want to be clear about that. Not tied to a post, not draped over my shoulders as a warning, knotted under my left ear, coarse as a feed sack, and I could feel the individual fibers of it against my jaw every time I swallowed. Cyrus Pell had me up on the back of a gray mule. My mule, which was its own kind of insult, and the oak branch they'd chosen was thick enough that it didn't even tremble under the weight of the rope thrown over it. That's the kind of detail you notice. That branch wasn't going to bend, or snap, or give you any kind of chance. Whoever had picked it knew what they were doing. 41 years I'd sat behind the bench in Cutter's Fork, and it had come to this. 63 years old. A mule. A branch that wouldn't give. Shh. I'll tell you what I was thinking. Not about my life. Not about my wife Helen, who'd been in the ground 14 years. Not about the sons I'd sent off to war and got back crooked. I was thinking about a pipe I'd left burning on my desk that morning. Thought, somebody's going to smell that and think I burned the courthouse down, on top of everything else. That was the thought in my head. The fire marshal is going to think I did it on purpose. The mind does what it wants. You need to know what Pell had on me before I tell you about Clara Birch, because the two things are tangled together, and I won't have you thinking she threw herself in front of a righteous execution. She didn't, but I also won't pretend what I'd done was clean. Cyrus Pell's boy, Danner, had come before me in August on a charge of beating a Mexican sheep herder named Tomas Garza half to death with a fence post outside the Rattlesnake Saloon. 3 witnesses. 2 of them Anglo, which I mentioned because Pell's lawyer made a point of the third one being Mexican himself, as if that canceled something. It didn't, not in my court. The evidence was clear. Danner Pell was 22 years old, mean as a stepped-on snake, and his daddy had run these Southern Ranges Valley for 20 years like a man who expected the earth to do what he told it. I sentenced Danner to 8 months at the territorial prison in Yuma. That was September 6th. By September 8th, Cyrus Pell had begun a quiet campaign to have my appointment reviewed by the territorial governor, citing what he called a pattern of rulings hostile to established ranching interests. He had 2 other men he'd been unhappy with over the years, and he strung their grievances together with his own into something that looked, on paper, like a case. By October, the governor's office was making inquiries. I won't pretend that didn't scare me. I was 62 then. I had the courthouse, the work, the use I was to the place. Take that away and what was I? A old man in a house that smelled like pipe smoke and old paper. 2 sons who wrote letters once a season and a church I attended out of habit more than faith. So I made a mistake. Not the one Pell would later accuse me of. I want to be plain about that, but a real one, smaller and stupider. Garrison Wade was a land speculator out of Tucson who was trying to buy up homestead parcels on the North Flats, and he had a contract dispute come before me in October, just as the pressure from Pell was building. Wade's case was sound. He should have won it on the merits, and I knew it, and I ruled against him anyway, because his lawyer had been hired on Pell's recommendation 2 years prior, and I was afraid of what another ruling that could be painted as anti-establishment would do to my position with the governor. I was wrong to do it. I knew I was wrong when I did it. I told myself it was strategic, that I was protecting my ability to do good over the long run by sacrificing one small injustice. That's what men tell themselves. It tastes like tobacco, and it sits in you like something you can't quite pass. Wade left Cutter's Fork, and I heard he went to another town and started over. I don't know if he made it. In December, Pell's man on the governor's staff, a political appointment named Holcomb, managed to unseal the complaint documents and get them to a newspaper in Prescott. The story they printed was not accurate. It said I had ruled against Wade in exchange for money from Pell. That was a lie. I had ruled against Wade out of cowardice, which is a different thing. But when you try to explain the distinction to a mob with a rope, it doesn't land the way you'd hope. By the time they came for me on that February morning, Pell had the story well built. I had been corrupt. I had been in his pocket. He was now righteously turning me over to frontier justice, which was a neat trick. The man who'd tried to destroy me through the governor's office was now presenting himself as too impatient with corruption to wait for official channels. 23 men. Couple of them I'd known for 20 years. Most of them I recognized from the courthouse steps or from Sunday services. They came at dawn, when I was still in my nightshirt, and they gave me long enough to put on my pants and my boots before they marched me out. They did not give me a coat. It was February. Clara Birch had been a widow for 11 months when all this happened. Her husband George had died of a lung sickness the previous March. Left her with the small horse ranch he'd built on the east side of the valley. A 12-year-old daughter, named Nora, enough debts that she'd spent the first 4 months after his death doing the accounting three different times, hoping she'd missed something. She hadn't. I knew George Birch. He'd come before me twice, once on a water rights question, once as a witness in a boundary dispute. A decent man. Quiet, the kind of man who built things carefully and didn't boast about them. He and Clara had been married 9 years when he died, and by all accounts they were well matched. I had met Clara twice. Once at a church social where I'd shaken her hand and said something forgettable about the weather. Once in the hall outside my courtroom, where she'd been waiting with George on the water rights matter, and I'd told her the hearing would be delayed an hour. She'd said that was fine. We had not had a conversation. That was the extent of it. I want you to understand that. She did not come into that road on my behalf, out of any particular knowledge of me or friendship or debt. She came in on the strength of something else entirely, and it took me a long time to understand what that was. What I know is that she had heard the noise of the men assembling at dawn, had sent Nora to stay at the neighbor's, had saddled her horse, and had ridden into town. And she arrived in that road, on the south end of Cutter's Fork at roughly the same moment that Cyrus Pell was telling the assembled men that it was time, and Harmondale, who I had once fined $40 for letting his fence fall across the stage road, was preparing to slap the mule's hindquarters. She came in a walk. That was the first thing I registered. Not a gallop, not a dramatic thunder of hooves. A walk. Like she had all the time in the world, and none of them were going to do a thing until she was ready. Her horse was a dark bay, a little heavy in the chest, and she rode it like she'd been doing it since before she could read. She stopped about 15 feet short of the mule and looked at me. Not at the crowd, not at Pell, at me. I don't know what my face looked like. I was cold. I was wearing my coat by then. They'd allowed me that much. But February at dawn in that valley is a specific kind of cold that gets into the joints. And I was afraid, though I'd been working very hard not to let it show. I imagine I looked like what I was. An old man on a mule with a rope around his neck, trying to maintain some kind of dignity in a situation designed to strip it away entirely. She looked at me for maybe 3 seconds. Then she turned to the crowd. "I want someone to tell me," she said, "what exactly the charge is." Her voice carried. It was not a shout. It was just a voice that was used to being listened to when she used it. Pell said, "Mrs. Birch, this doesn't concern. I asked what the charge is, Mr. Pell. If you're going to hang a man in the public road, I'd like to know what he's being hanged for." There was a silence. The kind of silence that a crowd makes when it realizes it has been asked a question it should have asked itself and didn't. "Corruption," someone said. Harmondale, I think. "Corruption," Clara repeated. She didn't say it with contempt exactly. She said it with the tone of a woman who has just been handed a coin and is checking whether it's real. "Bribery? Taking money from Cyrus Pell to rule in his favor?" "Yes," Pell said, "Mr. Pell." She shifted in her saddle slightly. "I've lived in this valley for 9 years. Before George died, I was not in the habit of paying much attention to courthouse business. In the 11 months since, I've had occasion to learn. I've talked to Garrison Wade, who everyone seems to believe the judge wronged." She paused. "Garrison Wade told me, in his own words, that he believes the ruling against him was a mistake, not a bribe. He left this valley angry and broke, but he never believed the judge took money. He said so to me directly. He said so to 2 other people I've spoken with." A silence, longer. "That's one man's opinion," Pell said. "It is," Clara agreed. "And here's another man's opinion." She looked at the crowd again, moving her eyes across them slowly like she was taking attendance. "Gerald Monroe, you had a contract dispute 2 years ago. The judge ruled against you. Was that a corrupt ruling or just one you didn't like?" Monroe, somewhere in the crowd, said nothing. "Pete Ashford, the judge fined your son for the incident with the Delgado water line. Was that corruption?" Still nothing. Harmondale, the judge fined you for the fence across the stage road. Were you bribed to allow that? Did the judge just enforce the law? I could see Dale's face. He looked like a man who had arrived at a party and was only now realizing he'd walked into the wrong house. What I'm hearing, Clara said, is that Cyrus Pell's son went to Yuma and Cyrus Pell didn't like it. And now there's a story in a newspaper in Prescott that says the judge is corrupt. And 23 men woke up before dawn and went to hang him. She stopped. Let that sit. Does anyone here have actual evidence of money changing hands? Not a newspaper story. Not Cyrus Pell's complaint to the governor's office. Evidence. The silence went on long enough that a horse somewhere behind me shifted its feet, and the sound of it was the loudest thing in the road. Then what you have, Clara said, is a man on a mule with a rope around his neck, based on the word of the man he ruled against. She looked at Pell directly for the first time. And I will tell you plainly, Mr. Pell, I think you know that. I think you know exactly what this is. Pell's jaw tightened. He was a large man, thick through the chest, and he had the kind of face that had never learned to accept contradiction. You're a widow woman on a horse, he said, and you'd do well to. I'm a widow woman on a horse who has been paying attention, Clara said, and I'm asking every man here to do the same. She turned to the crowd. If you hang this man today, based on what you actually know, which is a newspaper story and Cyrus Pell's grievance, you spend the rest of your lives knowing that. You'll know it when you sit in your own courtrooms, if it ever comes to that. You'll know it when your children ask you what happened to the judge in Cutter's Fork. She paused. I'm not saying he's a perfect man. I'm saying you don't know, and when you don't know, you don't hang. I was watching the crowd. I had nothing else to do. I was on a mule with a rope around my neck, and I could not get down, and I could not argue my own case, and the only thing left to me was to watch. What I saw was men looking at their boots. Men exchanging glances that were no longer the glances of a group moving in the same direction. I saw Harmondale take a step back, then another, and I saw the man next to him notice and do the same. Saw Gerald Monroe turn and start walking toward the street that led back to the north part of town. Cyrus Pell saw it too. His face went through several things in quick succession. Fury first, then calculation, then something that looked almost like surprise, as if he hadn't expected a widow woman on a dark bay horse to actually work. This isn't finished, he said, to me or to Clara, to the road in general. Then he turned his horse and rode. And the crowd, because that's what crowds do when the man driving them leaves, came apart. Not all at once. In the slow, slightly embarrassed way of men who have been caught in something and are now trying to remember where they needed to be. Within 5 minutes, there were 4 men left in that road, and within 10 there was just Clara, and me on the mule, and the rope still around my neck. She rode up alongside me, and reached up and worked the knot loose with both hands. She had to stand in the stirrups to reach it. Her fingers were cold. I could feel the temperature of them even through the rope, and it took her a moment because whoever had tied it had done so with intention. When it came free, she held it in one hand, looked at it briefly, dropped it in the dirt. She did not make a speech about it. She did not look at me with anything I'd call pity. What she said was, "You should get off that mule. You've been up there long enough." I want to tell you who I was in the weeks after that, because it matters. I was not a dignified man. I want to be honest about it. I had been a judge for 41 years, and I had carried myself a certain way, not with arrogance, I hope, but with the bearing of a man who knows what he is and what he's for. That bearing left me for a while. I moved carefully around my own courthouse. I heard what people said and what they didn't say. I knew which men had been in that road and which hadn't, and I knew that the ones who hadn't been there had decided not to be there for reasons that were not all about justice and not all about affection for me. I had a letter from the governor's office that said the complaint against me was being reviewed, and the word reviewed had a quality to it that made my stomach feel hollow. My pipe went out a lot in those weeks. I'd light it and then forget to draw on it, and it would go cold. Clara Birch came to see me on a Thursday, about 2 weeks after the road. She came to the courthouse in the mid-morning, with a tin of biscuits and a practical expression, and knocked on my office door and came in when I said, "Come in and set the biscuits on my desk." "People keep bringing me food," she said. sitting down in the chair across from me without being invited to. "'Cause George died and they think I can't cook. I can cook. These are from me, not in condolence. I appreciate it. You don't look well." It was such a plain thing to say that I almost laughed. "No," I agreed. Are you sleeping? Some." She looked at me the way she'd looked at me in the road. Directly, without the performance of tact. "I talked to a lawyer in Prescott about the newspaper story. A friend of George's from before. He thinks you have grounds for a libel action if you want to pursue it. He also thinks the governor's review is likely to come out in your favor, given that the core claim, that you took money, doesn't have evidence behind it." I looked at her. "Why are you doing this?" She thought about it. Actually thought. Didn't have an answer ready. "Because what happened in that road was wrong," she said finally. "And because I've watched this valley for 9 years, and I've seen how it runs, and I've watched men like Pell use the machinery of it for their own purposes, and someone had to say no." She paused. "Also," she added, "because I'm going to need a judge I can trust. I have a boundary dispute coming. And I'd rather go before someone who knows what evidence is." It surprised a laugh out of me. A real one, the first in a while. It hurt a little, the way something does when it's been unused. She stayed for an hour. We talked about the case against her, which was a legitimate one. A neighbor claiming her fence line was 50 yards inside his property, and the survey she had was old and the original markers had been moved or lost. We talked about how to approach it. She asked good questions, the kind that showed she'd thought about the problem before bringing it to me, that she wasn't looking to hand it off, but to understand it. When she stood to leave, she picked up the tin of biscuits and then set it back down. Again. "Leave those," she said. "You look like you forgot to eat." She came back the following Thursday and the one after that. We talked about the boundary case, and then about a water rights question a neighbor of hers was having, and then about other things, about George, some, and about Helen, and about what it was to lose someone who had been the architecture of your daily life, and to find that you had to build a new one from scratch. She said, "After George died, I was angry for about 4 months. Not at anyone in particular, just angry. Then I got tired of it and started working." "That sounds about right," I said. "Helen's been gone 14 years and I'm still building." She looked at me then in a way that was neither pity nor analysis, but something quieter. And she said, "Well, you're still here to build. We were not young people. I want you to understand that. I was 63 years old and my hair had been white for a decade, and there were mornings when my hands hurt with a kind of deep ache that no amount of flexing worked out." She was 38 and grieving and running a ranch on land that might be partly taken from her by a survey dispute. We were not in a position that invited romance in any storybook sense. But there is something that happens between two people who are honest with other, who don't perform. She was not performing for me, not presenting a version of herself she thought I'd prefer. She was just there, thinking out loud, asking real questions, telling me plainly when she thought I was wrong about something, which happened twice in those first weeks, and both times she was right. By April, I was eating regular meals again. By May, I had written the letter to the territorial lawyer in Prescott about the libel action. By June, the governor's office had closed the complaint against me with a terse letter saying, "Insufficient evidence of wrongdoing," which was the driest possible vindication, but a vindication nonetheless. Pell and I had not spoken. His son Danner had finished 4 months of his sentence and been released on account of good behavior, which I suspected had been arranged. That was the territorial prison's business and not mine. The boundary dispute came before me in late May. I recused myself and asked a circuit judge from Flagstaff to hear it, because I was not going to sit in judgment on a case where I had a personal interest, which is the kind of obvious thing that should not need saying but apparently does. The circuit judge ruled in Clara's favor on the merits, which had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the evidence she'd put together. A newer survey, signed statements from 2 neighbors who had seen the original markers, and a letter from the county records office in Tucson. She won it herself. I want that clear. By August, we had developed a habit. On Sunday mornings, I would walk to the early service at the church, not out of deep faith, out of the rhythm of it, the way you maintain certain habits because the body wants the structure, and after the service, she would often be there with Nora. And we would walk down to the diner on the main street and sit in the booth by the window and order coffee and whatever they had. That was fresh. Nora was 12 and had her mother's directness and her father's quietness, which was an interesting combination. She would read a book while we talked, or draw on whatever paper she had, and occasionally she would look up us and add something to the conversation that was startlingly perceptive for a 12-year-old, and then go back to her book. I had not sat across a table from a woman regularly since Helen died. I had eaten alone for 14 years, mostly over a desk or a sink, and I had told myself this was fine, that solitude was the natural condition of a man at a certain stage of life, that I had the courthouse and the work, and that was enough. You tell yourself what you need to tell yourself. Sitting across from Clara Birch on a Sunday morning, with bad diner coffee and good light coming in through the window, I began to understand that I had been wrong about that. Not dramatically wrong, just wrong the way. You're wrong about something you've arranged your whole thinking around, the way it has to be undone gently because it's load-bearing. She said something one morning. I don't remember the exact context. We were talking about the valley and what it was becoming, the railroad money coming in, the way some of the old ranching families were selling. And she said, I think some people mistake being used to something for being content. I did for a while. I looked at her across the table. She met my eyes, not performing anything, just looking. I think I did too, I said. Nora looked up from her book, considered this, and went back to her drawing. I asked her to marry me in October, a year after the governor's office began its review, 8 months after the rope. In my office at the courthouse, which is not a romantic setting, but the setting was where we spent most of our time. And I thought she'd find a more theatrical location suspicious. I was sitting at my desk, and she was in the chair across from it, the same chair she'd sat in that first Thursday with the biscuits, and we had been talking about something. The ranch, I think, a new hand she'd hired. And there was a pause, and I said it. Not well. I want to be honest. I said it with the awkwardness of a man who had been married before and knew what marriage was, which is to say that I was not full of the easy confidence of someone who hasn't tried the thing. I said something like, I think we've been moving towards something, and I'd rather we acknowledged it than went on pretending otherwise. I'd like to marry you, if you'd have me. She looked at me for a long moment. I wondered when you'd get around to it, she said. I didn't want to presume. You've been thinking about it for 4 months, she said. Don't tell me you haven't. I've watched you not mention it. She was right. Been thinking about it for 4 months. Well, I said. Yes, she said, if the question is still open. Yes, Nora, who had apparently been listening from the hallway, said, finally, in a tone of impressive dryness for a 13-year-old, and went away. We married in November in the church, with about 30 people present, not a large wedding. Clara had worn a dark blue dress, not white. She was practical about what the gesture meant, and she had her hair up in a way that I had not seen before, and she looked at me when she walked in with the same directness she had always had. And I thought, this is a woman who has chosen something, with her eyes open and both hands free. No one has maneuvered her into this, and no one is going to maneuver her out of it. There is a difference between being loved by circumstance and being chosen by someone who knows better. I had been married before, and that was love, too, and I don't dishonor Helen by saying that. But this was a different thing. Clara had seen me on a mule with a rope around my neck. She had seen me afraid and cold and stripped of everything that had defined me for 40 years. She had walked in on a dark bay horse and taken the rope off my neck and said you should get down now and then come to my office 2 weeks later with biscuits, because she had looked at what was there and decided she'd take it. That is not something you receive lightly. Pell sold most of his land the following spring. His son Danner drifted, as young men who are too accustomed to impunity tend to do, places where they can keep doing as they like. I don't know where he ended up. The newspaper in Prescott printed a retraction of their story about me. Buried on page 8, the kind of retraction designed to be seen by no one. The territorial lawyer said I could continue with the libel action if I wanted. I told him I'd let it go. Some things you can afford to put down. I have been on the bench for 3 more years now. I am 66. My hands hurt in the morning, and I get tired in a different way than I used to. Clara runs the ranch and raises Nora, who is 15 and has her mother's intelligence, and is going to be something this territory has not yet encountered. I walk the 3 blocks from the courthouse to the ranch house most evenings, and sometimes Clara will be on the porch when I get there, sitting with her coffee in the last of the light, and she will look up when she hears my boots on the path. She doesn't say anything, usually. She just looks at me the way she looked at me in that road, not with pity, not with performance, but with clear eyes and a settled expression, the face of a woman who is exactly where she decided to be. I sit down beside her. That's the whole thing, right there. A man can spend 60 years not knowing what that feels like, and then it comes. And it comes not in spite of what you've been through, but because of it. Because she saw what I was in the worst moment of it. Afraid, cold, stripped, old, and she decided that was still worth the ride in. The coffee goes cold while we sit there. Neither of us moves to warm it. The light goes off the valley in layers. The ridgeline holding it longest. She reaches over and puts her hand on mine, without looking at me or saying anything. Just puts it there, warm and still and certain. I think about the pipe I left burning on my desk that February morning. I think about the branch that didn't bend. I think about a man on a mule with a rope around his neck, telling himself that at least he hadn't let them see him afraid. He didn't know, that man. He didn't know a woman on a dark bay horse was 2 miles out and riding. I'm glad he didn't give up before she got there.